Part of the risk assessment process is to conduct a qualitative or quantitative calculation of the impacts and the probabilities of risk to our organization. These would be the last two steps within the risk assessment process: assessing the impact when a threat exploits a vulnerability and determining the probability that threats will exploit those vulnerabilities. So once the organization understands the threats and its vulnerabilities, it's able to take the next step and assess the impact. There's two primary methods for conducting these risk assessments. There's a qualitative and a quantitative method. The quantitative method is the most traditional method. This calculates the value of assets based on a dollar amount. Quantitative methods they're mathematical in nature. They require hard figures to determine the value of our assets. So it's ideal if your assets are easily calculatable. Oftentimes, quantitative risk assessment is time consuming. It requires a great deal of calculations, but on the plus side, it can be very accurate. The first step with a quantitative method is to calculate the single loss expectancy, or SLE. The SLE is the cost of a single loss. Let's take a simple example. Say we have a TV in the break room. That TV could cost $400. Now say that TV breaks, and it would take an employee 2 hours, maybe an hour to go buy the TV from a store, electronics store, and then an hour to install the TV, hook it up, and take the old TV away and dispose of it. Say the employees paid $50 an hour. Our SLE here would include the cost of the TV itself, then that $50 hourly rate times 2 hours, so that would equal $500. So our single loss expectancy, the amount we would have to pay to recover our TV in that break room, would be $500. Now that's a very simple example. We'd want to factor in, for a more complex example, other factors as well. Say we have an online store. We're an e-commerce company. Our online store generates $180,000 in revenue every hour, and we're a large store. So if our web server is taken offline, if customers are unable to make purchases, that's going to cost us $180,000 per hour. So we'd have to calculate that loss in for each hour that that resource is left offline. We'd also have to calculate the cost of the server if we need to replace it, and the cost of the manpower that it would take to bring that server back to a working state. So the single loss expectancy could be simple in some instances, or it could be very complex. The next step with a single loss expectancy, once you have that calculated, you want to calculate your rate of occurrence, usually annual rate of occurrence. Annual rate of occurrence, or ARO, the number of times a loss will occur in a year. So let's think about our TV in the break room, for example. That TV may break, if it's a fairly decent model television, maybe once every 5 years, with normal wear and tear, employees using the TV. The annual rate of occurrence for that TV would then be 0.2. It'd be a fraction. It wouldn't occur every year, but there'd be a 20% chance that it would occur each year, essentially. So once every 5 years would be 0.2. If it were broken twice a year, say we have very rowdy employees that like to play Nerf football in the break room, that could be 2. Twice in a year would be 2. But more realistically, let's say it'd be 0.2. So if we had an annual rate of occurrence of 0.2 and a single loss expectancy of 500, we would use those together to calculate what's known as our annual loss expectancy. Our annual loss expectancy would be the SLE times the ARO. The annual loss expectancy is how much we are expecting to lose from an asset each year. So if we can expect to lose a television once every 5 years and it costs $500 to replace that television, our annual loss expectancy for that television would be $100. Once every 5 years, $500. So we take 0.2 times 500, gives us $100. So the annual loss expectancy in our simple TV example is $100. We would calculate this for each business function, and the calculations of the annual loss expectancy are going to help us determine what security controls to put in place. Remember, we never want to put a security control in place that is more expensive than the annual loss expectancy. So we could, to protect that television, hire a security guard, have them stand in the break room and watch that television to make sure nobody breaks it or nobody steals it. Of course, that would cost far more than the cost of the television itself to replace. So we wouldn't use that as a mitigating control. We could, for example, put a lock on the TV or bolt it to a wall. Those would be reasonable steps to mitigate the loss, mitigate theft from the television. That probably, bolting that television to the wall probably would cost maybe $20 for the bolts and maybe some labor. So maybe we'll say $100. So that could be within our annual loss expectancy if we make that expense one time and we expect it to protect the television for several years. So we can calculate that out to be a $20 expense over 5 years, for example. That's a reasonable mitigation step, and we would then accept the residual risk that we would choose after, or we would have after we in place that mitigating control. But we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. Annual loss expectancy, this is the calculation that we use in a quantifiable risk assessment. The other, in order to do that quantifiable risk assessment, we needed to know our asset value. So the asset value in our example was the television. If we talked about our web server in the more complex example, the asset value is going to be the amount of revenue that web server generates for the business. So if we have a software development department, so we have a whole business process that develops $320,000 every day. Say we're a large software development company. The value of that department would include the cost of the servers and equipment and the amount of revenue generated by the department. So in a more complex example, that business process would have an asset value of the cost of the servers and also the amount of revenue that it would generate as well. We'd calculate that together. Another method of calculating risk is with a qualitative risk assessment. Qualitative risk assessment uses judgment and it uses risk categories, usually quantifiable statements such as low, moderate, and high. To determine a qualitative risk assessment, we base that on the likelihood of occurrence and the impact. Likelihood of occurrence and the impact. Likelihood of occurrence is how likely an event could happen in any given year, and then the impact would be the how disruptive that event would be. So likelihood of occurrence is the probability that a threat will exploit a vulnerability. Usually this is expressed as some sort of percentage. So for example, if we have a 100-year floodplain, if we're in a 100-year floodplain, there is within 100 years, a 1% chance that a flood would occur in our area. If we're in a 10-year floodplain, we have a 10% chance of a flood happening any given year. 100-year floodplain, we have a 1% chance. That's an example of a way a percentage can be used in a practical sense. And we can have, for example, maybe we experience power outages, major power outages that last more than 4 hours once every 10 years. We could say that there's a 10% chance of a power outage each year. Now we can map these qualitative statements to these percentages, and then we can have qualitative statements linked to them, such as likely to occur, unlikely to occur, very likely to occur, for example. So we can either describe them as the percentage, or we can describe them with these qualitative statements: likely to occur, unlikely to occur, somewhat likely to occur. That occurrence can be based, the amount of time for that occurrence can be based usually on the lifetime of the business process, or maybe over a measured time span. Now the impact is going to be the magnitude of harm that would occur when a threat exploits a vulnerability. There could be, for example, there could be a threat of a flood. Okay, would a flood cause significant damage to an organization if that organization was located on the 10th floor of a building? Perhaps not. So just because there's a threat of an event happening, in that instance an external environmental occurrence, a flood, that doesn't necessarily mean that the flood would have an impact. Perhaps that we could have other impacts like power outages, etc. There could be a threat of a volcano erupting. If that volcano is located too far away from the building, then there wouldn't be an impact, for example. So in qualitative risk assessments, the method, the impact is assigned. The amount of impact is assigned with a descriptor like low, moderate, or high. All of these, the impact and the likelihood of occurrence, are usually assigned a descriptor in that way. Likely to occur, somewhat likely to occur, and then with the impact, low, moderate, or high, that would be the overall impact to the business process. So different processes and different events will have different impacts for an organization. For example, employee laptop, if that goes offline, that could be a low impact if we just have one employee's laptop go offline. But if the authentication server goes offline, the authentication server that allows all employees to remotely access the company's network, then that would have a high impact on operations. So different devices, different business processes are going to have different impacts. Even with the same event, both these devices are going offline. They each have a different impact level. Now, qualitative risk assessment, the technique to determine this, how do we determine these statements if they're subjective? Great question. Usually we use multiple people all working together. We may have a council or a board of individuals, experts, individuals who are working in that business area or who have expertise. They've been with the company for a number of years. Those individuals are questioned. We can use surveys, and we can come up with a group consensus on how likely an event is to occur and the potential impact of each event. We can use historic data, or we can examine data from business competitors, for example. Now, qualitative statements, you might wonder, why would we use a qualitative statement over a quantifiable statement if a quantitative statement is so accurate? Well, qualitative statements can be useful when it's difficult or impractical to assign the dollar amount. So it could be difficult. The federal government uses these a lot when it comes to sensitive information, because it can be difficult to calculate or assess the damage to the government if, say, classified information is released. Usually it's described as, depending on the classification level, secret information could cause serious harm to the nation. Top secret information could cause very serious or critical harm to the nation, depending on its sensitivity. So that if there's a breach of data confidentiality, the classification level determines how harmful that would be. We can also think about this with health and human safety. You don't want to assign dollar amounts to people's lives. So you would assign, say we're doing a operation, or we're doing a cleanup operation after a hurricane, and there's very warm weather, high humidity, like after Hurricane Katrina, for example. You could have people going out cleaning buildings, cleaning debris. There could be a risk of heat stroke, and you would describe the risk of heat stroke depending on the humidity level and the temperature is either high, moderate, or low. And then that would help govern how often people need to take water breaks, how often they need to work at any given time, how long they could wear hazmat suits. So that's where a qualitative risk assessment can be very handy. Some techniques for using qualitative risk assessment include using a scoring system. We can assign a number value and then use a calculation to assign a risk level. Let's take a look at an example of how this is used in a practical sense. So we have this website, this is first.org, and they've created the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. This is what's used to calculate a numeric value for certain vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities that you may find with a vulnerability scanner. And CVE numbers, common vulnerabilities and exposures numbers, usually have an associated CVSS score. When you scan with a vulnerability scanner, you're often presented with your results sorted by the CVSS score. So this is how you calculate that score. You can use this calculator here, and the CVSS score would be this right here. All of these different flags together would describe what goes into the calculation. So as we change these, we can see we're changing certain values here. As I'm changing this, the score is dynamically changing. So if I have a high impact on integrity or a high impact of availability, we're going to change these values. Confidentiality and integrity are usually given more weight than availability. So if we have no impact on confidentiality and integrity, and then we put high impact on availability, we'll jump up to 5.7. If we have high impact on integrity and confidentiality, we have a 7.3 score. So you see how the score is changing and these values are changing. Then we have subsequent system impacts as well. These change these. So we can have a high category, or we can go down to medium, low, see how this is changing here? This is calculated with the CVSS. Now let's take a look at a CVE number. Here's one for a web service called MailCow. We have MailCow, open source groupware email suite based on Docker, and there is looks like a cross-site scripting vulnerability, a vulnerability that allows cross-site scripting attacks. So if we were to access this link here, we go to a GitHub link, talks about the impact and the vulnerability itself, and we have a severity score 6.1 that shows us that calculation that we just talked about. So here's the CVSS score right here, and that would be the same thing as this. Looks like they used a previous version of CVSS. This is CVSS 4.0, and this one here is a CVSS 3.1 calculation. So this is probably extension of an older vulnerability, though it does say this includes versions 2024 and later. That's just a practical example of how we use that CVSS scoring system to come up with a number and then rate that with a qualitative statement like moderate vulnerability. So it would be a moderate level vulnerability here. That's essentially how we use these qualitative and quantitative risk assessments. They're ideal for helping us determine the risk level within our organization, within our different business processes.